Would you like to know how you can eat more food and lose more body fat? Well, you've come to the right place. In today's discussion, Coach Dean and myself will go through what is a refeed. Refeed is a short-term overfeeding during the dieting phase where we elevate calories back up to maintenance or slightly above with predominantly carbohydrate. So today we're going to be going through what is a refeed, how does it work, how you can implement it, and what can you expect from it. I hope you enjoyed this video.
G'day everyone, I'm Dean. I'm here with Coach Alan.
Hey guys.
We are here today to discuss refeeds, which are always very exciting because people get to eat more food. Now, for those that don't know what refeeds are, that's perfectly fine. We will be discussing what refeeds are, the concept behind why we want to introduce refeeds potentially into somebody's diet, some of the benefits, whether or not there are any cons. And then we're also going to talk about things like how should we set that refeed up? What kind of calories do we need to hit? What kind of carbohydrates do we need to hit? And all of the in-betweens of refeeds. So this is going to be a refeed 101 with Dean and Alan from Flex Success.
Let's go. So what is a refeed? So a refeed essentially it's basically 1 to 3 consecutive days of where your calories return to maintenance or even above maintenance. Maintenance calories basically means like the amount of calories that we need to eat to maintain our body composition. So basically, if you look at it as a short-term overfeeding to bring your calories back up to maintenance level, the idea is to, obviously when you start dieting, it will comes with like negative adaptations, your leptin drops, your testosterone drops, your thyroid drops, your metabolic rate drops, and you feel more, the ghrelin increases, so you feel hungrier. So essentially the refeed is just to, I guess, our attempt to slow down some of these negative adaptations in the dieting phase, and also obviously the psychological side of things as well. So yeah, that's essentially what refeed is. And I guess I should also touch on the key macronutrients that's responsible for, I guess, for what we're trying to achieve is carbohydrates. That's the key macronutrients, and we'll touch upon that a little bit later on.
Awesome. That's going to confuse some people. I think we heard ghrelin, we heard leptin, we heard T3, potentially T4, testosterone, metabolism, all of the negative things for dieting. But as Alan said, refeeds there are basically to try and offset some of the potential negatives of the dieting phase, whether you be a general population client who's trying to lose weight or even an athlete who's trying to both maintain performance and also not lose muscle and lose lots of fat. So let's unpick some of those little bits and pieces that we're trying to manipulate. I think we should delve first into the physiology of what a refeed could potentially help us improve during a dieting phase. We'll unpick that a little bit, going from both the physiology of your metabolism, things to expect during a dieting phase and how a refeed can improve that. And then we'll move into more of the psychological benefits to also having a refeed before we go into a little bit more of the specifics. So Alan, I figured I might ask you the question so it's nice and easy. What are some of the expected negatives or things that we can expect to feel during the dieting phase in regards to the negative adaptations to calorie restriction?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, when we start dieting, like obviously our body doesn't care that we're trying to get a six-pack or trying to get lean for the stage or whatever. So essentially when you start dieting, you're eating less calories or you do more activities or whatever, your body recognizes that, I guess, if you look at it as like a survival mechanism, if you will. You start dieting and your body signal that basically started adjusting things to becoming more efficient in utilizing less fuel, obviously to stop the weight loss. Otherwise, you'll just keep losing weight and eventually die. So that's not what we want. So that's basically what a body is trying to do. And when you through all that process, obviously, then your body, your brain starts sending these signals, such as the hunger signals. That's what ghrelin is basically. So you start dieting, your body recognizes that, so, oh, this person needs food. So send the hunger signal. So you feel hungrier, or, let's say your thyroid hormone drops and all that, and you feel more lethargic and you have low energy, basically to your body trying to stop you from moving to achieve, bring the calorie deficit to cancel it out, to stop you from moving. So that's some of those negative adaptations. I guess the key thing is with all these strategies that we're trying to achieve with refeeds or diet breaks, as much as we would like to reverse some of that, but the matter of fact is the leaner that you get, these negative adaptation will come. So the best we can do with these strategies basically is, I guess, trying to slow down the process throughout. So essentially, I guess, allow you to eat more food in the period, so that way you can train better, you can maintain lean muscle mass better. So, but at the end of the day, as you're trying to get leaner and leaner, those negative adaptation will have to come. So that's I guess the truth, and that's what you have to accept. So that's why people like to say you have to suffer, and there's a bit of truth to that. But I guess this is where we can utilize these strategies to make the process a little bit more efficient, a little bit easier.
Absolutely. I'm in complete agreement there that although some of these physiological parameters we look at during the dieting phase may seem inherently negative, I think it's also important to recognize that this whole starvation process that people often refer to, it isn't as negatively impactful on your ability to achieve your goals as some people may perceive it to be. So if we look at starvation studies, generally speaking, the average metabolic downregulation, meaning how much our metabolism reduces its ability, is about the 15% mark. So we're talking like if somebody should be able to eat 2,500 calories, they maybe only be able to eat 2,150. So significant, but not massive. Now, if we look at the refeeds with those potential perceived benefits, some of those being that we're going to minimize the hunger hormone, ghrelin, that you mentioned. We're potentially going to re-stimulate a hormone called leptin, which is a signaling hormone from fat cells to tell their body if they're happy or sad. If they're empty, they're sad. Because like Alan said, we're talking about mitigating the potential for long-term starvation to cause death is essentially what dieting is, as morbid as that sounds. We also have other things too. There's a system in the brain called the hedonic system, which regulates taste and smell. So if anyone's dieted before, you're going to recognize everything tastes better, everything smells better. To keep this all, I suppose, in a nice little package, the goal, as Alan's already said, for the body is to stop you from starving. Now, even though refeeds scientifically don't tend to show huge impacts on these particular hormones long-term, they show impacts short-term in the acute phase. So if you have like between a 2 and 3 day refeed, we generally see the negative adaptations start to go back to positive. But then as soon as you go back to the dieting phase, they go back down again. Although that may be true, there's also some really cool research that I've read that compared 1 week on dieters versus full-time dieters. Now, the beauty of this was twofold. Group A were given a certain calorie target that they had to consume over 12 weeks. Let's just say they were in a 500 calorie negative deficit, right? So they just consumed that same diet for 12 weeks. At the end of that 12 weeks, they lost X amount of weight. Then they compared it to another group who actually consumed the same amount of calories relative to their body weight, so negative of 500. They did 1 week at negative 500, 1 week at back to maintenance, alternatively for 24 weeks. So they actually dieted for the exact same time. They both dieted in a calorie deficit of 500 for 12 weeks, except group B took double the time to get there because they had breaks. And what they basically found was the group B that did the off and on, they maintained more muscle mass, lost more fat. And the beauty of it, like you said, Alan, they consumed more calories by the end of that deficit. So even though we may look at the physiological stuff and say, it's not really that big of an impact, I think that's very true in the short term. But I think in the long term, if we think about a diet over 20 to even 52 weeks for a general pop client, having some refeeds in and around particular times is going to be highly advantageous. So in light of that, when do you think refeeds should be implemented?
Obviously different coaches do different things. It depends on the client. Obviously, there's always going to be the answer. I'll give you 2 examples. So for complex clients, I usually start at anywhere from 24 to even 30 weeks out. Obviously, these are for natural athletes. So the way I like to run things, as you know, I will start off just 1 day of refeed from the dieting phase. Obviously 6 days into deficit and 1 day refeed. But obviously the idea for that is it doesn't really going to do anything physiologically in terms of the positive benefits, but more so for psychologically. And also it allows me to, I guess, establish like a baseline of where it should be. And then I'll diet roughly anywhere from 6 to 10 weeks, depending on the person, and I'll run a full diet break. So that's kind of tied back into the study that you mentioned, what 1 week on, 1 week off, basically to have a little break in between different phases to allow you, I guess, both physiological and psychologically feel better. And obviously the idea is to maintain your performance and obviously stimulate further fat loss. And then I'll move into another 6 to 8 weeks of dieting, but then I'll transition into 5 low days and 2 back-to-back refeeds. This sort of where we're starting to look at, obviously as the person gets leaner, and this is where we're starting to look at implement things like this to, I guess, trying to slow down some of those negative adaptations. Then by the very last phase, roughly from anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks out, or even 6 weeks out, that's my transition. I'll run another full diet break, and I'll transition into 4 low days and 3 consecutive refeeds. And this is where, I guess, by that point, an athlete should be pretty damn lean just to get the last bit off. So this is where you really see those negative adaptations comes into play. So that's where 3 days, I guess, it's the maximum that we can really do, because obviously then if you do 4 days refeed, then you only get 3 days of dieting. So that doesn't really work. So that's when we, I guess, trying to really work on those, slowing down those negative adaptations. So that's in short, for athletes getting ready for a physique contest. Now for general pops, because we usually, with our educational program, we usually run most people, I guess, anywhere from 12 to 20 weeks. That's for someone they're trying to lose body fat. So usually the first 2 weeks, I'll put it on maintenance. And then as soon as I start dieting, I'll do 5 low days and 2 high days. 2 refeeds. But obviously, at the very first stage of the dieting, you don't really need refeeds. But my idea behind it is because for general pop, or for most people, I guess, without that athlete mindset, I suppose, or don't have that goal to be as strict, it's good to have those 2 days on the weekends, especially, I guess, to have some social lives and that sort of stuff. So I tend to find that allows me to increase the overall compliance, and also, I guess, kind of feel like, okay, 5 days of working hard, 2 days I can enjoy some food or whatever, go out with friends and whatnot. So I think that works quite well with general pops. But obviously that doesn't really do anything until like the later on as the person gets leaner. But I found just that 5 days of dieting, 2 refeeds for general pop tend to work pretty well, because on the weekends, that's where most people have more social commitments and stuff like that. So that's how I like to run things. So I would like to hear how you like to run things.
I would essentially just earmark exactly what you said. I think I follow essentially the same protocols. If an athlete is enhanced, like you said, then the necessity for refeeds is less, because some of the hormones that they utilize will offset the natural hormones that would downregulate. In saying that, though, we just brought up the psychological aspect, which is extremely important. So I think if we just take what you just said and just clean that up to some application really quickly, it is that the longer you diet, the more frequent you may require a refeed. The leaner you are, the more frequent you may require a refeed. Between 1 and 2 days of refeeding is primarily going to do 2 things. It's going to refill glycogen, stored carbohydrates, so that you can perform better. But it's also going to have a psychological break, so you can also perform better and feel better. But we're probably not expecting too many under the hood physiological changes. So all of those sort of metabolic rate based hormones. When we get more towards the extremely lean individual, though, doing multiple days, and like you said, a diet break being at least 7 days, I would say a minimum of 5 days, but anywhere up to 14 days of returning back to maintenance calories, that's when we're really going to see the long-term or longer-term benefits for physiological function. So for anybody that's listening to this and wants to try and implement that into their strategy, the start of dieting requires less, the end of dieting requires more. the fatter you are, the less you need. The leaner you are, the more you need. Pretty fair, I think. How much do you, or how do you determine your refeed? You said you set the base at the beginning. So you're basing the carbohydrate content and the calorie content off their original maintenance before you started dieting, or are you working that out somehow?
So basically when I'll use the maintenance of where they start as a baseline, and obviously I'll bring the adjusted protein and fats according to the low days, and I'll just drive the carbohydrate up to achieve that maintenance. And obviously that's something that we have to monitor throughout the fat loss, because obviously as your body weight drops, your maintenance regulates too. So, but usually I'll adjust protein and fats, and I'll just keep the carbohydrate as high as possible, unless I really have to. But that's where you sort of can monitor how they respond, how the body weight fluctuates throughout the refeeds. But just by adjusting protein and fats, usually that would sort of offset some of that. And I guess as the leaner you get, you tend to get away with a little bit more carbohydrate anyway. So that seems to be the case. But yeah, so basically it's essentially right from the start, drive the carbohydrate up to maintenance, bring adjusted protein and fats, and I'll just use that as a baseline and adjust it accordingly throughout the dieting phase. Yeah.
Cool. What sort of adjustments are you doing? My personal is, I generally also do the same. I set the original refeed based off the original maintenance when they started dieting, because it's a pretty easy way just to put that back in. Plus, we've already had feedback on that in their growing phase. I tend to drop protein between 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram. If they've been at 2.5, then they'll go down. If they're up at 3 for whatever reason, they'll also go down. I tend to put fats as low as they can physically deal with. For me, that would be around about 0.5 grams per kilogram, or 15% of calories is sort of where I'll bottom them out, depending on the phase they're in. But we know they don't really need the fats. The problem is they don't physically need the fats, but psychologically the fats taste delicious.
Yeah.
That's where the variability in client is going to change the application of, I suppose, what we do as coaches. So, but if we had to pick the best refeed ever, it would be lowish protein, low to moderate protein. So you still have some satiety, you still have some muscle retention support. Fats as low as you can possibly get them, anywhere between 15% of calories and say up to half a gram per kilogram of body weight. And then the remainder of calories coming from carbohydrates. If we were to try and give some overreaching ones on those, I would probably say that you can still maintain protein at 2 to 2.5 grams, even 3 grams per kilogram if you really wanted to. There's no detriment to that, other than that you're minimizing the amount of carbohydrates you can consume. And fats could go up to 1 gram per kilogram, or maybe say 20%. I wouldn't be inclined to push them up to 30%, purely because it's unnecessary for them to go that high, and it's going to impact how much carbohydrates you can consume. And where and how you would decide which ones of these numbers you choose, I would say, again, the leaner you get, the longer you've been dieting, the more you should push to the lower fat, lower protein, as high as carbohydrate possible. But in the beginning phase, you can probably stay a little bit higher in the other three.
Yeah. So pretty much like what you said, but what I usually don't touch the protein and fats. I'll only adjust it as the low day drops. Let's say if my low day fats coming down, I'll also adjust the fats on the refeed days. But towards the end, if I see some when someone's body weight drops really low and get really lean, and I see there's a massive weight increases throughout those refeeds, then I would use the protein and drop it right down to just to bring the calories back down a little bit. But carbohydrates never touched, and fats will always come down as the fats come down. So.
And are we talking same macros, same carbs, same calories for all 3 days?
Yes. Cool. All the same for 3 days, yeah.
And let's just unpick that last little bit quickly. Why do they not need fats?
Well, first of all, fats don't do much in terms of, and there has been studies on fat doesn't really do much in, I guess, for what we're trying to achieve. The deposition of fat doesn't really do anything for, I guess, glucose metabolism and all that stuff. And obviously the idea for refeed is to stimulate the main hormone, which is leptin, which is the main hormone that regulates body fat and body weight. and that's what we're trying to stimulate, which is associated with carbohydrate, mainly carbohydrate only. So fats doesn't really do anything. That's another reason why we drive the carbohydrate up.
And likewise for performance, we're not really relying on the storage of intramuscular triglycerides to drive performance. Instead, we need carbohydrates to provide glucose, to provide high octane, high intensity fuel. So the fats are really playing in the psychological domain. The carbohydrates are playing in the physiological domain. Understand that both are important, but the thing that we're really trying to manipulate is the physiological. So that's why we go higher carbohydrates, or as higher carbohydrates as we possibly can. Now, one thing I think people mess up is how they implement that refeed. You mentioned briefly, and we just brushed over it without probably some people even recognizing what you were talking about with highs and lows, and how a refeed can be implemented in the week, but we still achieve a weekly fat loss goal. So one thing that was really important said from Alan before was that we couldn't really ever do 4 refeeds and 3 low days or deficit days on a consistent basis, because if you look at that, the stimulus that's most consistent throughout the week is weight gain, being calorie surplus or calorie maintenance, whereas we want the dominant one to always be fat loss and deficit. So at most, I would say you should only ever have a maximum of 3 days consistently done on a refeed. And again, this is at the very end point of dieting. Most general pop clients should never need 3.
Yeah.
They really shouldn't even probably need 2, because the metabolic shutdown is quite small in comparison to what they're trying to achieve. But they can, for the psychological benefits, like you said, of having social weekends, and that's perfectly fine. So how would you set up the week so that you understand that the goal is still fat loss? If you just want to maybe break down the calorie balance equation, and we'll go from there.
So as I said, as I transition from 1 day to 2 day to 3 day, obviously, when I do that, I'll make sure the weekly overall calorie, the calorie intake, is still in the deficit. So that meaning that obviously if I do consecutive 2 to 3 days of refeed at maintenance, that means I just have to pull more calories out to create a deficit through those limited days of dieting. That could be from obviously the amount of food that you eat, pull more calories down, or add more activity levels on those days. So that's where I sort of structure training differently on those days too, but that's only very, very specific to very lean individuals getting ready for a contest. But for general pop, like you said, 5 days, 2 days, then you can still eat this amount of food for most people on those 5 days without having to really put the calories down to get those 2 refeed days.
Cool. So yeah, lower days are essentially to offset the higher days so that your weekly calories are the same.
Yeah.
So essentially, from a mathematical point of view, for people that like the numbers, if you were doing 2,000 calories a day of dieting, that means you're eating 14,000 across the week. If you are going to increase your calories to 3,000 for 2 days, it means you now have an additional 2,000 calories across the week you need to remove off the other 5 days. So you would take 400 calories off. So you'd be doing 1,600 Monday to Friday, 3,000 Saturday and Sunday.
Correct.
That would be how that would look. So that's really cool. It is definitely one thing I think people mess up.
That's another very, very good point, because that's why we don't recommend cheat meals, because you can't measure. And also, obviously, you tend to go with foods that's very, very high in fats. Obviously, carbs as well, but that sort of defeat the purpose. But the main thing is because you can't measure. Because in order to achieve the ultimate goal, we have to make sure we are in the calorie deficit as an overall. We just have a different setup in that days. So that's very important. And obviously, measuring is always going to be the number one thing, because if you can't measure, then you can make changes.
Absolutely. No bueno for no, not allowed. I think we pretty much nailed this, but I just wanted to touch on one little thing that you mentioned before as well, for those that are athlete orientated and are putting their refeeds in throughout the week. How do we choose what days go into the refeeds? You and I have a slightly different approach here, so it'll be interesting to sort of unpick this a bit too. So I'll do my approach, then you can do yours, and then we can bring it all together before we wrap this up. But so the consideration for refeeds for me, like we said, are twofold. Potentially to offset physiological downturn in metabolism, psychological, And the biggest one I think that people really misunderstand and don't even consider is performance. Knowing that we need at least 2 days, preferably 3 days, to get the physiological benefits for those that are doing the long-term dieting. I also prefer them to be 3 consecutive days, but occasionally I will do 2 days, followed by 2 days of dieting, followed by 1 day refeed, followed by whatever many days are left over. I think it's another day of dieting. But I tend to find that when you do it that way, that the scale weight and all of the measurement data that we use gets a bit skewed and it's confusing and it's probably not relevant. So I would say for me, implementation as well, I like 3 consecutive days, so we're on board there. One thing that I personally do though, is I always ensure that at least 1 day is done on a rest day to maximize glycogen retention, glycogen reuptake from the day prior, so that we're at least having a full day of refeeding, I guess you could say, as opposed to potentially offsetting the refeed day with a little bit of additional exercise. One thing I think we're definitely in agreement on though, is that you tend to bring steps down on the refeed day so that it's like a legitimate break. So if we're measuring activity through daily steps, bring the steps down on that refeed day so that when they're in the fat loss phase, we can drive them up a little bit more. So yeah, my approach is 2 training days, consecutive refeeding. Generally one of those will at least be a volume day, preferably the day before the rest day, so that then they've depleted glycogen to a certain point of time. And then the next day, they will do a full-blown refeed, rest, feed up, fill the cell up with fuel, and then they go again for the rest of the week. But yeah, interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so as we talked about this already, but so I do things a little bit more different. So I look at it more so from, I guess, probably more psychological, really. So when I move into like the very last phase of 4 low days and 3 high days, that's tend to be, you should be pretty damn lean by then. And you should feel pretty crap most of the time. So my thing is always performance is going to be my number 1 priority, because that's obviously, as a natural athlete, that's going to be the number 1 indicator of how much muscle you can maintain, of how much weight you can lift, basically. So I tend to structure my training differently. I will structure 3 days of training on those 3 refeed days, and I tend to put those 3 days of training to be a little bit high intensity and lower volume. My reason being, because 4 low days, the calories tend to be pretty damn low, because in order for you to achieve the calorie deficit and to have those 3 high days, right? So on those 4 days, the last thing I want to do is to go in there and suck myself up to lift some heavy weight. So that's my thinking behind that. So I tend to put like more of a volume-based, low percentage workout, in tons of metabolite work just to on those low days, because then you don't have to think about or sucking yourself up for a set. You just basically get in there, get it done, and you're good. And you burn, obviously, you probably tend to burn a little bit more calories, I guess, almost turn into like a HIIT workout type, short rest periods and that sort of stuff. And on the 3 refeed days, because I have so much more carbohydrates, my thinking is that, okay, psychologically, you feel like there's more food in you, you get a better pumps, and hopefully you can perform a little bit better. In reality, first day of feeding, you're probably not going to feel any different, because obviously it probably takes like at least 24 to 40 hours to actually properly refill the glycogen to have some sort of performance benefits. But yeah, so I like to just structure it that way. I guess more so for a psychological standpoint. But another thinking is, because I'm having so much carbs on those days, if I can do some sort of training, perhaps it can help drive the glycogen into the muscle cells as well. I guess that's not a good point for, obviously, for natural athletes. That could be something that can be utilized to help, I guess, throughout the process. And another very good point is, for a lot of us, that's very, very, I guess, tend to weigh in, because by that point you're weighing yourself every day, right? You have so caught up on the scale weight. When you have a full day of refeed and not doing anything, usually the weight goes up the next day, and some people freaks out. Whereas if I can do a bit of training on those days, they tend to minimize that and tend to obviously stress us down, performance better. And a lot of times, like you and I spoke about this, we always see some very, very new, like low weigh-ins during those refeed days, which is very interesting. So yeah, that's basically my thinking behind it. Probably more so psychologically than actually doing anything, because the end goal is the same, but just a different setup. So I look at it more so from, I guess, if I can feel like I can perform better, I can get any benefits out of it, then I'm going to tend to go that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with your way and my way. That's the beauty of this, is that I think that so long as the baseline 3 days is kept consistent, that's probably the primary benefit to those 3 refeed days. How you situate your training there is really up to the individual, so that you get the most out of it. I'm also in agreement, whether you are enhanced or non-enhanced, performance for me is paramount when it comes to prep athletes, because it ensures muscle retention. It also ensures output. So if we can control those 2 variables, we generally will retain more muscle, burn more fat. So whether or not you do one, I definitely would never do 2 rest days for anyone that wants to do 2 rest days. I think that's just gluttonous, unnecessary, and more than likely you're not getting the benefits. I really do like the intensity approach, so that they're not just burning through the carbohydrates that they're otherwise eating, but I can kind of offset that then by obviously the next day, when those receptors are super sensitive still to nutrients, we can still drive them in and get that from the carbohydrate. So whichever one suits you best is kind of there, so long as the framework is right.
That's the whole beauty of this, is that like we said, you still have to die, you still have to suffer, that's the bottom line, and you still have to feel those negative. Doesn't matter how much carbohydrate you have, like that's the thing. You probably feel worse on those days, really. So because you feel hungry yourself. So either way, it just, whatever strategies that it's going to allow you to be more compliant or allow you to perform better, allow the process to be a little bit smoother, that is always going to be the best strategies.
Absolutely nailed that, mate. And I think we'll leave it on that. Compliance is key.
That's it. It's always the case.
And that wraps up today's video. I hope you found it useful. As always, be sure to give this video a like if you love the content. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. And finally, check out the description below if you want to know how to find us on Facebook and Instagram, or if you simply want to find out what other cool stuff we have to offer. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.